the resident in room 412. I've been a night shift nurse for about 6 years now, so I'm well acquainted with the vibe of a hospital at 3 a.m. Most people think it's silent, but it's actually a cacophony of low-level noise. The rhythmic hum of ventilators, the distant, muffled moan of a patient in post-op, and the constant, clinical squeak of rubber soles on linoleum. You learn to tune it out. But St. Jude's has this one wing, the old oncology ward on the 4th floor, that feels different. It feels like the building itself is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Last month, we had a patient in room 412. Let's call him Mr. Henderson. He was a terminal case, a frail man in his late 80s who had reached that stage where the medicine was just a formality. He was incredibly quiet, never complained, never pushed his call button for water or extra blankets. But he had this unsettling habit. Every time I walked in to check his vitals, he'd be sitting bolt upright in bed, staring at the empty vinyl visitor's chair in the corner of the room. He wasn't just looking at it, he was watching it, his eyes tracking something invisible as it moved. One night, around 2:45 a.m., the call bell for 412 started chiming. It was the first time he'd ever used it. I hurried down the hall, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. When I walked in, the room was freezing. I'm talking see your own breath cold, despite the thermostat being set to 74. Mr. Henderson was trembling, pointing a skeletal finger at that empty chair. "Tell her she can't have it yet," he whispered, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "Tell her I'm not finished with it." "Tell who, Mr. Henderson?" "There's no one here," I said, trying to keep my professional nurse voice steady while the hair on my arm stood straight up. "The night nurse," he gasped. "She's waiting for my breath. She says it's her turn to carry it." I checked his oxygen levels and heart rate. Everything was stable, though his pulse was racing. I figured it was just ICU psychosis, a common side effect of heavy sedation and isolation. I gave him a mild sedative, tucked the blankets around his chin, and headed back to the nursing station to chart the encounter. About an hour later, I was looking at the security monitors. The hallway outside 412 was empty, but then I saw a flash of white. A woman in a vintage nursing cap, the tall, starched kind they stopped wearing in the late 70s, was walking toward his room. She was moving with a strange, fluid grace, her arms perfectly still at her sides. I stood up, confused. We don't have any staff who wear caps, and no one should have been on that floor at that hour. I stepped out of the station and called out to her. "Excuse me? Can I help you?" She didn't turn. She didn't even break her stride. She just glided into room 412 and closed the door behind her. I ran down the hall, my heart hammering against my ribs. I burst into the room, ready to confront a trespasser, but the room was empty. Except for Mr. Henderson. He wasn't in the bed. He was standing in the center of the room, illuminated by the pale blue glow of the monitors. His eyes were wide, glazed over, and he was moving in that same, sickeningly fluid way. He was gliding, in a circle around the visitor's chair, his feet not quite touching the linoleum. When he saw me, he didn't scream. He just leaned in close, his face inches from mine, and whispered in a voice that was high-pitched, feminine, and utterly cold. "The shift is over, David. It's time to clock out." I didn't stay to check for a pulse. I backed out of that room, ran to the locker room, grabbed my bag, and walked out the front doors. I didn't even call my supervisor. I just sent a text saying I resigned, effective immediately. I heard later that Mr. Henderson was found 5 minutes after I left, tucked neatly back into his bed, stone cold. But the kicker? The nurse who found him said the visitor's chair was spinning slowly in the corner, and the room smelled like roses and formaldehyde. The pediatric ward's new friend. My younger brother, Leo, was always the adventurous one, so it wasn't a surprise when he ended up in the hospital. It was supposed to be a routine appendectomy, but some post-op complications kept him in the pediatric ward at Children's General for a full week. If you've never been to a pediatric ward at night, consider yourself lucky. During the day, they try to make it cheerful. Bright murals of cartoon animals, colorful floor tiles, and playrooms. But at 2 a.m., when the overhead lights are dimmed to a sickly purple glow, those painted animals seem to develop a predatory stare. By the third night, Leo started talking about the blue boy. He was only 9, so I figured his imagination was just working overtime fueled by the heavy pain meds. He told me that every night, right after the shift change, a kid in a faded blue hospital gown would come out of the shadows and sit on the end of his bed. Leo said the boy didn't look like the other kids. His skin was the color of a bruised plum, and his eyes were empty like a doll's. "He tells me stories, Maya," Leo whispered to me one afternoon. He tells me about the basement. He says it's where the son goes to die, and that it's much bigger than the hospital up here. I tried to laugh it off, telling him it was probably just another patient playing a prank. But then I saw Leo's sketchbook. Leo has always been a talented artist, usually drawing superheroes or dinosaurs. But these new drawings were disturbing. He had sketched the hospital corridors, but instead of doctors and nurses, the halls were filled with tall, spindly figures with no faces, all wearing those same blue gowns. In every drawing, there was a small figure at the center with a void where its face should be, pointing toward a black square labeled the hole. The fourth night, I decided to stay over on the pull-out cot next to his bed. I wanted to see if a visitor really was sneaking in. I fell into a light sleep around midnight, but I was jolted awake at 3:15 a.m. by the sound of Leo giggling. It wasn't his normal, happy laugh. It was a rhythmic, breathless sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I stayed perfectly still, squinting through the darkness. Leo was sitting bolt upright, his hand extended into the empty air as if someone was shaking it. But there was absolutely no one there. Then my blood turned to ice. I looked at the foot of Leo's bed. The heavy thermal blanket was depressed. There was a clear physical indentation on the mattress, the exact size and weight of a small child sitting right there. I watched, paralyzed, as the indentation started to move. It wasn't jumping, it was a slow, deliberate crawl, the weight pressing down the blankets as it moved up the bed toward my brother's legs. "He wants to show me the basement now," Leo said, his voice sounding flat and hollow. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and flicked on the flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, hitting the foot of the bed. The indentation vanished instantly, the blanket springing back up as if a weight had been lifted. But when the light hit Leo's face, I almost screamed. His eyes weren't brown anymore. They were a flat, milky cataract blue. He didn't blink as the bright LED hit his retinas. He just stared at me with a look of absolute, cold fury. "You made him go away," Leo whispered. His voice didn't sound like a 9-year-old boy's anymore. It was layered, like 3 people speaking at once. "He was going to take me to the quiet place. Now he says you have to take his place in the basement, so I can go." The monitors next to his bed started flatlining, a long, continuous beep echoing in the small room. Nurses came rushing in, and I was pushed out into the hallway. They stabilized him, claiming it was a temporary seizure. But Leo hasn't been the same since he came home. He doesn't play outside. He doesn't draw superheroes. He just sits in the basement of our house, in the dark, staring at the floor. And sometimes late at night, I hear a second pair of footsteps down there. The sound of someone gliding across the concrete, followed by that same breathless, rhythmic giggling. The mirror in the morgue. I work as a transport tech at county-level trauma in Chicago. People think the hospital is all about the ER, the sirens, the shouting, the adrenaline. But my job is what happens after all that noise stops. I move the patients who didn't make it from the bright lights of the trauma bays down to the cold storage in the sub-basement. You learn to be respectful, you learn to be quick, and more than anything, you learn to keep your head down. The morgue isn't a place where you want to linger. Last Thursday, I was pulling a double shift. Around 3:30 a.m., I got a call to transport a John Doe. They'd pulled him out of the Chicago River near the old rail bridge. No ID, no tattoos, nothing but a heavy, waterlogged weight on the gurney. The body bag was still damp, and as I pushed the cart toward the service elevator, I could hear the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of river water hitting the linoleum. The elevator ride down to the sub-basement feels like it takes an hour. It's an old, industrial lift that groans with every floor you pass. When the doors finally slid open, the air was thick with the smell of cleaning chemicals and that heavy, damp basement chill. Now, there's a long hallway leading to the cold lockers. A few years ago, the night staff put up this massive, ornate mirror with a heavy silver frame. They said it was to brighten the place up and make the windowless hall feel less claustrophobic. Personally, I always hated it. There's something wrong about seeing your own reflection when you're pushing a dead man. As I started to walk down the hall, I kept my eyes on the back of the gurney. But as I passed the mirror, my peripheral vision caught something that made my stomach drop. I stopped. I looked at the mirror. In the reflection, I was there, standing in my blue scrubs. But the gurney was empty. I looked down at the real-world gurney, right in front of my hands. The body was there. I could see the shape of the head through the plastic. I could see the water pooling at the bottom of the bag. I looked back at the glass. My reflection wasn't holding the handle of the gurney anymore. He was standing with his arms at his sides, perfectly still. And the John Doe? In the mirror world, he wasn't in a bag. He was standing right next to my reflection. He was soaking wet, his skin a bloated, sickly gray, and he was leaning in, whispering something directly into my reflection's ear. Then, the John Doe in the mirror turned his head and looked directly at the real me. He didn't have eyes, just dark, wet pits where they should have been. He pointed a pruned, gray finger at his own chest, and then he pointed it at mine. In that exact second, my lungs felt like they'd been filled with lead. I couldn't draw a breath. It felt like I was inhaling freezing river water. My knees buckled, and I hit the floor, gasping, clawing at my throat. As I lay there, looking up at the mirror, I watched my reflection do something impossible. He smiled at me. Not my smile, a jagged, hungry expression I've never made in my life. My reflection stepped away from the John Doe, turned around, and walked out of the mirror's frame. I heard the sound of real, physical footsteps on the linoleum next to my head. The me from the mirror walked right past my collapsed body, whistling a low, tuneless melody I'd never heard before. He pushed the heavy double doors to the morgue open and disappeared into the darkness of the locker room. The John Doe in the mirror stayed behind. But as I watched, his face started to shift. The gray, bloated skin smoothed out. The dark pits filled in with brown irises. Within seconds, the thing in the mirror looked exactly like me. He started clawing at the glass, his mouth open in a silent scream, his hands smearing the inside of the mirror with water. I finally managed to gasp in a breath of air, but it tasted like silt and rot. I scrambled to my feet and ran for the elevator. I didn't go back for the gurney. I didn't even go back for my keys. I've been sitting in my apartment for 3 days now. I haven't gone back to work. I've covered every mirror in my house with bedsheets. Because every time I pass one, I hear a faint, muffled tapping from behind the glass, and a voice that sounds exactly like mine, pleading for me to let him back out.